A man wakes up, swings his legs out of bed, and walks down a short hallway toward his kitchen. By the time he reaches the coffee pot, he has crossed an international border. No checkpoint, no fence, no flashing lights, just an ordinary Tuesday morning that happens to begin in one country and end in another. For decades, nobody in this town thought twice about it. Neighbors wandered freely across the line, borrowed tools, attended each other's birthday parties, and barely registered that a national boundary ran straight through their living rooms. Then, almost overnight, this quiet geographical curiosity turned into one of the most heavily scrutinized stretches of land on the continent, monitored by cameras, sensors, and patrol units that didn't exist a generation ago. And the deeper you dig into how this border came to exist, the more absurd the story becomes, because the line was drawn long before satellites, GPS, or even some of the towns it now slices in half. The border between the United States and Canada stretches for nearly 9,000 kilometers, making it the longest international boundary on Earth, far longer than most travelers ever realize. For most of its length, it behaves the way a border should, running along rivers, lakes, and open countryside. But scattered along this enormous line are pockets where the boundaries stop behaving rationally altogether, slicing directly through library reading rooms, family homes, and entire towns, turning everyday errands into bureaucratic puzzles nobody could have predicted. Take the small town straddling the border between Vermont and Quebec. Over 100 years ago, a wealthy family decided to build something unusual, a grand stone library and opera house, deliberately placed so that the building itself would straddle the line. Inside, a thick painted stripe runs across the floor of the reading room, marking exactly where the United States ends and Canada begins. Patrons can sit in a chair with their feet in one country and their head in another. Upstairs, the situation gets stranger still. The stage of the opera house sits entirely in Canada, while most of the audience seats sit in the United States, meaning performers technically act on foreign soil while their applause comes from across an international line. The rules governing the building are remarkably strict. Visitors who enter through the American door must exit through that same door, and stepping out the Canadian entrance instead can trigger a confrontation with patrol officers waiting outside. When photographs of this building first circulated online, theories exploded across forums and comment sections. Some claimed the structure was a deliberately engineered tax loophole for wealthy families looking to dodge one government or the other. Others insisted it had served as a covert meeting point for spies during the Cold War, allowing agents to exchange documents without technically crossing any border on paper. A more colorful theory framed it as a smuggler's paradise, where contraband could be tossed between windows while officials looked away. The real story, as it turns out, has nothing sinister behind it. The family who funded the building wanted to give two divided communities a shared space to read, learn, and watch performances together, a literal monument to friendship outlasting any line on a map. Border authorities on both sides recognized the gesture and granted the building a unique legal exemption that still exists today. Not every divided structure was built on purpose, though. Further along the boundary, ordinary residential streets contain houses where the international border cuts directly through bedrooms, kitchens, and bathrooms. Residents might brew their morning coffee in Canada and drink it on a couch sitting in the United States. Property taxes for these homes require splitting square footage between two separate governments, with lawyers sometimes brought in just to calculate the exact percentage owed to each side, and even something as simple as an electrical fire becomes complicated since emergency dispatchers from both countries first need to determine which half of the house the flames started in before deciding whose fire department responds. Online, these divided homes have spawned their own mythology. Some commenters insist they function as built-in escape routes for criminals, since a suspect who crosses from the American side to the Canadian side mid-chase could technically leave local police without jurisdiction. The explanation behind these houses is far less dramatic. In the late 1800s, surveyors were sent to mark the border using nothing but compasses, ropes, and the stars overhead, trudging through dense forest and swampland with no satellites to correct their course. Their measurements drifted off target by hundreds of meters in places. And by the time more precise instruments existed, entire neighborhoods had already been built atop the mistake. Rather than evict thousands of families, both governments simply let the error stand. Sometimes a single straight line on an old map didn't just cut through houses, it cut off entire towns from their own country. One coastal community sits at the very tip of a peninsula that technically belongs to the United States, despite the only road leading there passing through Canadian territory first. Residents must clear passport control twice just to reach the rest of their own nation, and school children without a local high school cross the international border 4 times daily simply to attend class. When global travel restrictions suddenly shut borders down entirely, this town found itself cut off from the country it legally belongs to. Conspiracy theorists have floated everything from secret government isolation experiments to hidden military installations buried deep beneath the local school. The far less exciting truth traces back to a treaty signed in faraway London in 1846, where diplomats drew a straight parallel across a map without checking the actual shoreline, severing the peninsula's tip from the mainland in the process. Even stranger anomalies appear, where old maps were simply wrong. One isolated American pocket of land sits stranded inside a Canadian lake, accessible only by boat in summer or treacherous ice roads in winter, with a lonely unmanned border booth where travelers must press a button and speak to an officer through a video screen. Local legend paints the area as a lawless zone or a secretly disputed territory too dangerous for guards to patrol in person. In truth, 18th-century treaty negotiators relied on a map drawn by a cartographer who had never actually visited the region, sketching the lake's shape from secondhand sailors' rumors. When real surveyors later arrived, the lake described in the treaty didn't match reality, forcing officials to draw an awkward line through swamp and open water just to technically honor the original agreement. Perhaps the most unsettling sight along the entire boundary isn't a building or a town at all, but a clearing. Stretching across roughly 1,000 kilometers of wilderness, a perfectly straight strip of cleared land cuts through forests, climbs mountains, and crosses swamps without ever bending an inch. A corridor about 6 meters wide, kept permanently free of trees. Hikers who stumble across it often describe an eerie, unnatural feeling, since nothing in untouched wilderness forms lines this geometrically perfect. Online theories have ranged from secret military laser testing to buried pipelines connecting hidden underground bunkers. The real explanation is almost mundane by comparison. An international commission maintains the clearing precisely so the invisible legal boundary remains visible on the ground, sending crews with chainsaws into the wilderness roughly every 15 years to cut back regrowth. Since left alone, the forest would erase the line within a few short years. For most of the 20th century, these border oddities remained charming curiosities rather than sources of tension. Locals crossed freely to pick mushrooms, visit relatives, or borrow a cup of sugar, operating on trust rather than documentation. That changed dramatically after security policy shifted following major terrorist attacks in the early 2000s, when both governments tightened enforcement across even the most obscure crossings. Concrete barriers now block once open roads, hidden sensors monitor footsteps in the grass, and surveillance cameras track movement along streets that used to feel like a single shared neighborhood. Residents in once divided towns describe a new constant unease replacing the old sense of freedom, joking darkly that their hometowns have become unwitting testing grounds for the latest generation of border technology. In the end, the strangest thing about this border isn't the library split in half or the town stranded behind foreign checkpoints. It's the reminder that every one of these lines exists only because humans decided, centuries ago, to draw them on paper they never expected ordinary people to live inside of. A border has no shape in nature, no fence built into the landscape by anything other than treaties, rulers, and the occasional tired surveyor with a faulty compass. Yet once that imaginary line gets written onto paper, it gains the power to divide bedrooms, separate children from their classrooms, and quietly reshape entire lives, proving that the world is rarely as simple or as solid as the maps we draw of it.